The spring mud had not yet dried when the Calloway girl found out her future had already been decided. Clara Elspeth Calloway stood at the kitchen window of the house that had belonged to her father and watched the men in the yard below, without any particular feeling she could name. There were 3 of them. 2 were neighbors come to discuss the fence line along the northern pasture. The third was Harlan Pruitt, who owned the feed store in Ocotillo Creek and who had, according to her father's letter, been promised her hand in exchange for the forgiveness of a debt that amounted to $260. Her father had been dead 11 days. She had not cried. She had not stopped working either. The garden needed turning, the chickens needed feeding, and the letter from her father's attorney in Santa Fe needed reading twice before the words arranged themselves into something she was willing to believe. The Calloway land in the Cimarron territory, 160 acres of drought-scarred grass and 1 productive well, now belonged technically to her. But the debt it carried belonged to Harlan Pruitt, and Harlan Pruitt had, according to the letter, already been given a verbal promise by her father that Clara would become part of the settlement. A verbal promise from a dead man. She was 23 years old, and she had not been asked. Harlan Pruitt was 51, soft in the middle, and had buried 2 wives already. He was not a cruel man by any measure the town applied. He paid fair prices, he attended church, he did not raise his voice in public. What he was, in Clara's private estimation, was a man who had learned that patience and money together accomplished most things that direct action could not. He had waited 2 years since his second wife passed. He was willing to wait a few more weeks for the mud to dry and the mourning period to end. She turned from the window when the men shook hands and began to disperse. She did not look at Harlan Pruitt as he walked back toward the road. She did not want him to see her face, because she did not trust what her face would say. What it would say was, "I have not agreed to anything." The notice she put up in Ocotillo Creek was modest. She wrote it herself on a piece of brown paper and tacked it to the post outside the general store on a Tuesday morning when the street was quiet. Help wanted, 1 ranch hand. Wage paid in board and meals until harvest, cash after. Must know horses and fences. Apply at the Calloway place, 3 miles north on the creek road. She did not ask permission to put it up. She did not tell Harlan Pruitt she was doing it. She told herself this was simply practical, because the land would not manage itself, and she could not do it alone. And this was true. It was also true that having a working ranch under her own name by harvest time would complicate certain conversations about debts and settlements considerably. 3 men came the first week. 2, she turned away in the first 5 minutes, 1 for the smell of whiskey on him at 9 in the morning, and 1 for the way he looked at the house rather than at her when he spoke, calculating what it might be worth. The 3rd came on a Friday, just before the noon meal, on foot. He was not what she had been expecting, though she could not have said what she had been expecting exactly. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean without being thin, with the kind of quiet that settled around him the way dust settled after a wagon passed, gradually and completely. He had a canvas pack over one shoulder and boots that had been resoled at least once. He did not take off his hat until she came to the door, and when he did, he held it in front of him rather than dropping it to his side. "My name is Edmund Vane. I saw your notice." She looked at him for a moment. Most men who came to the door looked at her as though she were a problem, standing in the way of whoever owned the place. This one looked at her as though she were the person he had come to speak to. "How long have you been working ranches?" "Since I was 16. Started in Kansas. Worked in Colorado for 4 years, then down into the territory last fall." She asked him about horses, about wire fencing, about what he knew of adobe repair and well maintenance. He answered each question directly, without embellishment, and when he did not know something, he said so without apology. That last part was what decided her. "You can start Monday. Meals are at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. Board is the bunkhouse on the south side. It needs a new door, which you can fix once you settle in." He nodded. He put his hat back on. "I will be here at 5:30. I can start on the door before breakfast." He walked back down the creek road. She watched until he reached the bend where the cottonwoods hid the path. It was the first decision in 11 days that had felt entirely like her own. Edmund Vane was as good as his word, and Clara discovered fairly quickly that this was not a small thing. He arrived at 5:30 on Monday morning and had the bunkhouse door planed, fitted, and hung by the time she called breakfast. He ate what she put in front of him without comment, thanked her, and went back to work. He did not make conversation for the sake of it, and he did not ask questions about the ranch or its history until the second week, when he had earned the right to need the answers. She found herself paying attention to the quality of his silence. Most men who kept quiet around her were doing so out of discomfort or disinterest. Edmund Vane was quiet, the way a man was quiet when he was listening, when he was taking stock of a situation before he opened his mouth and changed it. The first fence line he walked with her, he noticed the post rot before she pointed it out. These three need pulling. The wire is still good. If we replace just the posts, we can save the run. She had planned to replace the whole run. His estimate would save her nearly $4 and a full day. She told him to pull the posts. He did not say anything about having been right. She noticed this too. The calendar on the kitchen wall had a small iron lantern painted at the top of each month, the same lantern repeated 12 times in slightly different light. Morning gold, midday flat, evening amber. Churches sent them out at the new year, cheerful and earnest, and she had kept this one because her mother had put it up 2 winters ago, and she had not been ready to take it down. She thought of it sometimes in the evenings when she lit the actual lantern on the kitchen table and sat down with the account book. The accounts were not good, but they were not impossible. What they needed was time and a productive harvest and no further surprises. Harlan Pruitt came on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. He came in the afternoon, which was when she was least busy, and she suspected this was deliberate. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door with his hat already off. She let him in because she had not yet figured out how to refuse entry to a man who believed he had a claim on the place. He sat at the kitchen table and she gave him coffee, which she did not want to do but did, because it was easier than refusing and she was not yet ready for that conversation. "You have a hand working the ranch. I heard in town." She said nothing. "I only mention it because people will talk. A young woman alone with a hired man. No family on the property." She poured her own coffee and sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Pruitt, I have 160 acres, 3 milk cows, a dozen laying hens, and a debt that needs paying down before winter. The only way to do any of that is to have the ranch operating. That requires help. I hired help." He nodded as though he were considering the logic of it, rather than receiving it as a fact. "Your father and I had an understanding, Clara." She had been waiting for this sentence. She had rehearsed her answer to it many times in the past few weeks, and what she found, now that the moment had arrived, was that the rehearsed answers all felt too careful, too managed, as though she were trying not to wound him. She decided to be plain instead. "My father had an understanding. I was not part of that conversation. I do not consider myself bound by agreements I was not present to make." Harlan Pruitt looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. "The debt is real, Clara. $260. It does not go away because your father does. I know it is real. I intend to pay it, through harvest revenue, if you will give me until October." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, closer to disappointment, and she understood that his disappointment was genuine, which made it harder to be simply firm. "That is a great deal to ask of the land, given the last 2 dry years. I know that too." He stood. He picked up his hat from the table. "I will think on it." He rode away. She sat at the table until the coffee went cold. She did not tell Edmund about the visit. It was not his problem. But she was aware, in the days that followed, of something shifting in how she thought about the summer ahead. It was no longer abstract. It had a shape now, and a deadline. The rains came in May, which was later than they needed, but better than nothing. Edmund spent 3 days clearing the irrigation channel that ran from the creek to the east pasture, a job that required wading in cold water up to the knee and moving rocks that had shifted over the winter. She brought him his noon meal at the channel on the second day, because it seemed wrong to make him walk back to the house and lose the light. She sat on the bank while he ate, and they talked, for the first time, about something other than work. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Missouri, near Joplin. Family still there?" He set down the bread she had brought. He did not answer right away, which told her the answer was complicated. "I had a wife. She passed 3 years ago. We had a son. He went with fever the same winter." She sat with that for a moment. She did not say she was sorry, because the words felt too small. "That is a heavy thing to carry into a new country." He looked at her. "Yes, it is." She looked at the channel, which was running clear now, where it had been blocked. "You come out here to forget or to start over?" He was quiet a moment. "I am not sure there is a difference. Not after long enough." She thought about her father, about the letter, about the way grief and obligation had arrived together like two horses on the same rope. "No, I suppose there is not." They did not say anything else for a while. The creek moved. The cottonwoods made their dry sound in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that two people can only sit in together when they have stopped trying to manage what the other person thinks of them. She took the lantern back to the house that evening and lit it and sat with the account book, but she did not look at the numbers for a long time. The recurring trouble with the east fence presented itself in the first week of June. Clara had known about the disputed section since before her father passed. The fence ran along the boundary between the Calloway land and the parcel to the east, which was owned by a man named Decker Holst, who ran a small operation and who had been, for as long as Clara could remember, the kind of neighbor who considered ambiguity a resource. The disputed section was a 40-foot run where the original survey markers had been lost to flooding some years back. Her father had placed a cairn of stones to mark his understanding of the line. Holst had, at some point in the past 2 winters, moved the cairn 12 feet west. Edmund found it on a Tuesday when he was walking the fence line with a post pounder and a coil of wire. He came back to the house at midday and told her plainly what he had found. "The cairn has been moved, and there are post holes on the far side of where it sits now. Fresh ones." Clara looked at him. "He's trying to push the line." Edmund nodded. "How much land does 12 feet take?" "About a 1/4 acre along that run. It does not sound like much, but the well access sits just inside that margin." She understood immediately. Without the well on her side of the line, she would need to negotiate with Holst for water access every season. It was not about a 1/4 acre. It was about leverage. Decker Holst was not the kind of man who took disputed ground by force or by legal maneuver. He took it by accumulation, by small shifts and quiet adjustments and years of nobody pushing back. Her father had not pushed back, partly because he was not a contentious man, and partly because the debt to Pruitt had made him feel as though he had little ground to stand on in any dispute. Clara felt something clear and cold settle through her. "I'm going to Holst in the morning." Edmund looked at her. "Do you want company?" She thought about it. "Yes." They went in the wagon at 8 in the morning. Decker Holst was a man in his 60s, with a weathered face and the eyes of a person who had spent decades reading people for weaknesses. He came to the door of his house when he heard the wagon, and he looked at Clara, and then at Edmund, and then back at Clara. "Miss Calloway, what brings you out?" She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. "The cairn on the east fence line. I need you to put it back where it was." Holst tilted his head as though he were thinking. "Now, I am not sure what you mean. I have not touched any cairn." She looked at him. She did not raise her voice and she did not look away. "There are 12 feet of disturbed ground on the east side of where that cairn sits, and fresh post holes along a line that runs west of the original position. I have not measured the distance, but I will measure it today. And when I do, I will have it in writing, and I will file it with the county office in Santa Fe." Holst looked at Edmund. "Your man there, he tells you all this?" Edmund did not move. He did not speak. He was watching Holst, the way a patient man watches something that has not yet decided which way to go. Clara stepped forward slightly. "He showed me what he found." "I am the one talking to you." Holst was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a reasonable man, Clara." "My father is gone. I am here." Holst looked at the ground for a moment, then at her again. "I will have my boys reset the cairn by Friday." She climbed back into the wagon. "Today, Mr. Holst, by noon." She picked up the reins. She did not wait to see whether he was surprised. They drove back in silence for most of the first mile. Then Edmund spoke up from the bench beside her. "He will do it." "I know." "How did you know he would fold that fast?" She thought about it. Men like Holst run on the assumption that no one is watching closely enough to call him on it. The moment you name it exactly, describe what you found, say you will file it in writing, the thing stops being a quiet shift and starts being a documented act. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "You have thought about this kind of thing before." She looked at the road ahead. "I have had to." He did not say anything else, but she felt, in the silence that followed, that something had been recognized, not just her capability, something else. The specific cost of having had to develop it alone. The cairn was reset by noon. She went to check it herself. Edmund came with her and didn't say she did not need him there. The summer moved forward, the way summers in the Cimarron territory moved, in heat and hard work and occasional grace. The cows produced well. The east pasture, once the channel was running clear, greened up enough to support the small herd through July. The hens were reliable. The kitchen garden needed daily attention, but repaid it. By mid-July, the account book was showing a number Clara was willing to believe in. Edmund learned the ranch the way a person learned a piece of music, not by reading about it, but by playing it until the difficult parts stopped requiring effort. He found the broken gear in the pump housing before it failed completely. He repaired the chicken wire without being asked and replaced 3 boards in the barn floor that had been soft since winter. He did not tell her about these things when he had finished them. She noticed them herself. She found herself watching him work sometimes when she did not need to. Not in the way she would have been ashamed of, but in the way you watch someone who moved through a space as though they belonged to it, as though they were native to it, in a way that surprised you, given how recently they had arrived. One evening after supper, when the heat had broken and the sky was doing the amber and rose thing it did in the hour before dark, she brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch and set one on the rail beside where he was sitting. She did not ask if he wanted it. He picked it up. They sat and did not talk for a while. She thought about the promises that had been made for her, without her, and how strange it was that she was sitting here on the porch that belonged to her father in a life she had not chosen, and finding it, gradually, more hers than she had expected. "You are making this work," Edmund said. She looked at the horizon. "We are making it work." He looked at her. She felt the look rather than saw it. Yes, that is true. The lantern on the kitchen table was visible through the window, a small amber square of light in the darkening house. She thought of the calendar above it, its painted lanterns cycling through their 12 versions of the same light. There was a version of this evening, she thought, in which she was not here, in which the debt had already been settled in the way her father had arranged, in which this porch belonged to Harlan Pruitt, and this quiet belonged to someone else. She was glad she was here instead. Harlan Pruitt came back in August. He came in the late afternoon and he came unannounced, which was different from his usual practice. Clara saw him coming up the creek road from the window, and she dried her hands and went to the door. Edmund was in the south pasture. Pruitt tied his horse. He came to the door with his hat in his hands. His expression was not angry. It was the expression of a man who had made up his mind about something and was not entirely comfortable with his own conclusion. Miss Calloway, Mr. Pruitt. He did not wait to be invited in. He sat on the porch step instead, which was somehow more direct. I have thought about what you said, about paying the debt through harvest. She stood in the doorway, and he looked at his hat. The harvest you have got coming is not going to cover $260 in one season. We both know that. She said nothing. What I have been thinking is this. Your father owed me that debt. Your father is gone. The land was his, not yours. And what he promised me is tied to what he owed, not what you owe. She waited. He looked up at her. I am going to forgive the debt, Clara. She stood very still. I am not doing it because I expect anything. I want to say that plainly. I thought I did when I came here in the spring. I thought what your father had arranged was a fair arrangement, and I was willing to wait for it. But I have watched you this summer. The way you handled Holst, the way you have kept this land running. Your father was a good man, but he did not see you clearly. I think I was making the same mistake. She sat down on the porch rail. She did not know what to do with her hands. You do not owe me anything for this. It is not a bargain. It is just the right thing, which I should have said in April and did not. She looked at him for a long moment. Why now? He turned his hat in his hands. Because I am 51 years old, and I have buried 2 good women, and I know the difference between a woman who would be content with what I have to offer and one who would spend the rest of her life running past the edges of it. You are the second kind, Clara. You always were. Your father could not see it because he was worried about the debt. I could not see it because I was lonely. But it is true. She looked at the yard. The cottonwoods along the creek were going yellow at the edges. Summer was ending. Mr. Pruitt. That is a generous thing. He stood. He put his hat back on. It is the true thing. He put his hat back on. That is different. He rode away down the creek road. She sat on the porch rail for a long time after the sound of the horse faded. Edmund came in from the south pasture as the light was going. He came around the corner of the house and saw her sitting there and stopped. He did not ask what had happened. He came and sat on the step below the rail and waited. Harlan Pruitt forgave the debt. He was quiet for a moment. All of it? All of it. No conditions. He looked at the road. What does that change? She thought about it carefully. Everything. And nothing. The land is the same. The work is the same. But I am not managing against a clock anymore. He looked up at her. What does that mean for the fall? She looked at him directly. She had learned over the summer that he could hold a straight look without flinching or crowding it with something else. It means I can think past harvest. He held her gaze. Can I ask you something? Yes. His voice was quiet and careful. Not a voice making demands, a voice feeling its way. Is there anything you are thinking past harvest toward? Her hand was resting on the porch rail, and his hand came up and rested beside hers, not covering it, just beside it, close enough that the backs of their fingers touched, and neither of them moved away. It was a small thing, the smallest possible thing. She felt it from her hand to the center of her chest. She could have answered his question in several ways. She had been alone long enough and careful long enough to know how to keep her own counsel. She had spent months learning the difference between what Edmund Vane did, because he was paid, and what he did because of something else, something she had watched take shape gradually through the summer, something she had not named to herself, because naming it felt like reaching for something before she was sure it was real. Now she was sure. Maybe. I think I am. He nodded once. He looked at their hands on the rail. Then I would like to be part of what you think about, if that is something you would consider. She looked at him. She thought about being 23 and having your future arranged for you without your knowledge by two men who both thought they knew what was best for you. She thought about the spring morning she had put up a notice on a piece of brown paper and tacked it to a post. She thought about what had come walking up the creek road on a Friday before noon. I would consider it. Their hands did not move. The cottonwoods made their dry sound in the evening wind. October came in cool and gold. The harvest was not as large as Clara had hoped, but larger than she had feared. And when she sat with the account book after the last of it was brought in, the numbers told a story she was willing to live inside. The land was hers without condition. The well was on the right side of a correctly placed cairn. The east pasture would carry the herd through winter with careful management and 2 good months of autumn grass still in it. Edmund winterized the bunkhouse in the first week of October, which meant new chinking in the north wall and a second layer of planking on the floor. He did not say he was planning to be in it through the winter. He did not need to say it. She brought him supper in the bunkhouse one evening when the first real cold had come and the house felt too large for one person and the bunkhouse felt too small and cold for one person, and it seemed more sensible to eat together in the kitchen. But she had made the supper before she thought it through, and so she carried it across the yard instead. He opened the new door when she knocked, and the lamp inside threw him into a warm outline. She held out the plate. "It is cold," I thought. He took the plate with one hand, and with the other he held the door open. "Come in if you like." She stepped inside. The bunkhouse was spare and clean, with his canvas pack hung on a nail and his boots beside the door, and one photograph on the windowsill in a small frame. She had not seen the photograph before. It was a woman and a small boy, both looking seriously at whatever had been on the other side of the camera. She looked at it. He did not say anything for a moment. She would have liked this place, I think. He did not look away from the window. She liked the open country. Clara looked at the photograph. She looks like someone who knows her own mind. He sat down with his plate. She did. It was one of the things about her I was not prepared for when we were young, and one of the things I missed most when she was gone. He looked up at Clara. "You have it too." She looked at him. "What?" "That quality of knowing your own mind." She sat down across from him. "I did not always know it. I think I had to find it this year." He ate. She sat with her hands around her coffee. The lantern between them was the same old lantern from the kitchen, the one that had stood on the table through all the evenings of the account book, and the quiet suppers, and the long months of deciding what this land and this life were going to be. She had carried it across the yard with her, without thinking, the way you carried something that had become part of how you moved through the dark. When supper was finished, she picked it up to go. He walked her to the door. His voice was very quiet. "Clara." She stopped. "I'm glad I came up that road." She looked at him in the lamplight. She thought of the notice on the piece of brown paper. She thought of a man who had taken off his hat and held it in front of him and looked at her as though she were the person he had come to see. So am I. She walked back across the yard. The grass was silver with cold and the stars were very bright, and the light from the bunkhouse door was behind her until she reached the porch, where the kitchen window made its own warm square in the dark. She went inside. She set the lantern on the table. She sat down and opened the account book and looked at the numbers, which told her the land was hers and the debt was gone, and the winter was coming in manageable, and the spring after that was something she was already planning for. What she had at the start of that year was a house, a wound, a debt, and no say in what her own future would hold. What she had now was all of those things settled, and one quiet man on the far side of the yard who had come to her on foot and stayed because something here was worth staying for. She closed the account book. She did not need the numbers tonight.